Hello and welcome to First Flight, a Star Trek Enterprise rewatch podcast where we are watching and discussing each episode of Enterprise in succession. First Flight is a proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network.
This is Commander Tucker of Enterprise. We've got some information you're going to want to hear.
Welcome, Enterprise fans. I am your co-host, Melanie.
And I'm your co-host, Abby.
And tonight we are discussing Dear Doctor, the 12th episode of Season 1. This episode was written by Maria and Andre Jacques Maton and was directed by James A. Contner. It aired on January 23rd, 2002. But before we begin our discussion, we need to issue a read alert.
Tactical alert. All hands to stations.
There are potential spoilers ahead. We might end up talking about any part of the series at any time. And now for a summary of the episode, it's time for Abby's Captain's Log. Okay, Abby, let's go.
Captain Starlog Supplemental.
Okay, my summary of Dear Doctor. Dr. Phlox faces an ethical dilemma as a dying race, the Valakians, ask him to save them from annihilation by pandemic. This is not as easy as it seems when he discovers something surprising about the Menk, another humanoid race on the planet.
All right, it's time to deploy our Subspace Amplifiers and get into this episode. Abby, what were your impressions of Dear Doctor?
Well, I know that John Billingsley, who plays Phlox, says that this is one of his favorites of the entire run of Enterprise and by far his favorite of Season 1. And there is a lot of reason to that. Besides this being a beautiful Phlox episode, this is just a beautiful episode. I love that this is the format of him talking as if he's giving a letter. Because it's more than a log entry when it's a letter. It's more personal, and it's got that stamp of this doesn't have to be a report. This can actually be just my thoughts and feelings. And that serves this episode so well. And to have all of that starting and going over while he's feeding his whole menagerie, and it's so quirky, and you get to see him interact with the captain and with Porthos and his bat, and he chews that funny looking slug thing. This is delightful. And I know that when I was first watching Enterprise, all I wanted was more about Phlox. So it's a brand new race. He's so interesting. He's got a different perspective. And as soon as I saw this cold open, I knew this was going to be one where we were delving into Phlox. And I, for one, was thrilled about that.
I completely agree with you, Abby. This is a top-notch episode. Not only is it a great episode, you're right, it's a wonderful Phlox episode. It's an acting tour de force for him. And we get so much insight into Dr. Phlox's thoughts and so much backstory through this letter that he's writing. You get to really get a sense of what he's thinking and about his observations of what he sees around him. And I find the backstory so interesting as well about the Denobulan mating season and the combatants and the bars to go to and stuff like that. That was really interesting. And there's also so much wonderful face acting in this episode. And I know we'll be talking about specific scenes later, but I agree. I can see why he said this is one of his favorites. It's certainly one of mine.
Well, and one of the things that I like in general about this episode, too, is that we see his dynamics and interactions with lots of different people in this episode. So it's not just we're going to do an episode that gives us more about Denobulans. We're going to give you an episode more about Phlox because we see him interacting quite in depth with Captain Archer, with Hoshi, with Crewman Cutler, with T'Pol. I mean, that's 4 big relationships right there. And they all have meat to them in this episode and the scenes he has with them. And that's unusual. Usually we're looking more at our big 3, Trip and T'Pol and the captain. And so to get all these interactions with these different people throughout the episode was really, really nice.
That's a really good point. You're right. He did have a lot of scenes with different people that were interesting and fascinating. And I also like the way they wove in the everyday real world stuff that we've talked about before, how we like to see the everyday stuff going on in the Enterprise, like the movie night and the mess hall. And I just wanted to add, when Phlox is eating alone at the mess hall table and asks Malcolm to join him, and Malcolm's busy. I know Phlox is totally fine. He's totally cool. He can eat by himself, but I wanted to literally jump into the TV screen and join him because I felt bad and I wanted to just sit down with him. You know what I mean?
I completely understand that. And I have to say that now that I'm rewatching these episodes with more of a critical eye, not only am I watching how they're eating and how they're interacting, but I'm watching what they're eating. And in this scene, like maybe Malcolm didn't sit with him because he was literally eating the round scoop of cottage cheese in a lettuce leaf. And I'm like, wow, I'm sure he enjoyed it because we know he enjoys all human foods. But that was just really funny for me to notice. I'm like, wonder if someone just went over to craft services for that one, because that's an odd choice.
That's funny. I love seeing the food on Enterprise.
Yeah, it seems like it's either really, really healthy or really, really over the top. There's not a lot of in between thus far. Like, it's never just spaghetti and meatballs night.
You know, Abby, watching this episode several times, I really came to realize that there is so much jam-packed into this in such a subtle, casual way. I'm not saying there aren't heavy moments. There are heavy moments, but the pacing of it is just beautiful. And you come to realize that there's about 12 different commentaries happening here, one after another, one profound and thought-provoking thing after another. And one of the things I found interesting that he mentioned was when he said to Cutler, yes, we used to have movies, but we gave up on, that kind of entertainment because we discovered that our real lives are more interesting.
Yeah.
And I know it was kind of just a quick line, but when I thought about it later, there's another commentary, maybe, 20 years later, about us and our screen time and our lives. And trust me, I love screen time. I'm not judging. I'm just saying that kind of hit home for me. I found that interesting that was the Denobulan take on that.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And I think it's so Phlox to be watching the people watching the movie more than he is watching the movie, because he is pretty much the doctor, but also the counselor on this ship. So he is learning so much about humans, and to hear what he's observing and noticing and being impressed by and realizing is kind of a human quality. All of these things are coming out as he talks to Dr. Lucas in these letters. And that is so interesting. And it reminds me, and maybe we need a soundbite for this at some point, of a TNG callback to Data's Day when he's writing the letter to Bruce Maddox and talking through a whole day. And we see a lot of that normal of the Enterprise Day. And now here we are seeing it in actual Enterprise. And I think it's just it's a neat parallel, and it's a device that can be overused, but is perfectly done in both episodes, and possibly even a little better in Dear Doctor, because it is moving the plot forward on so many different pieces of where Enterprise is going in the first season. No scene in this episode is unintentional or unconnected. And I think that's what makes this one so powerful, is you can watch it alone, and it's a beautiful metaphor, but you can also watch it in the series and realize at this point they're about halfway through the first season, and they're realizing how they're pulling some of these threads together. And it's really nice to see that they had that thought pattern in mind from the beginning.
Wow, I really appreciate what you just said. I hadn't thought about that, but the vibe of Data's Day, the comparison of Data's Day, really rings true for me. That's a great point. It has that same feeling. And yes, TNG soundbite, that sounds like a cool idea to me. I really liked what you said about each scene was intentional. There's not a wasted moment in this. It has that pace that I like, that I did not articulate well. There's something about the pace that I like in this episode, but it's meaningful. There's no filler. It does all go together cohesively, like you were saying. And there's just so much thought-provoking stuff that when you're done watching it, at least I find for me that this one stays with you. I've been thinking about it a lot.
Yes. One of the things that I like about this episode is that it shows how Enterprise lives in the gray. It's not all black and white. And I love Trek that is black and white. But I think DS9 often is the one that people talk about being all about gray areas and hard choices. But you know what? In DS9, the good guys are still the good guys, even if sometimes they make questionable choices. And the bad guys are still the bad guys, even if sometimes they make kind and compassionate choices. In Enterprise, it's even more convoluted because everybody's trying their best to be out there being a good guy, and they're making all these mistakes. And there's so many levels and layers of gray area that they don't even realize they're in until they're lost in the fog, and they're making the best out of it and finding their way and doing things wrong sometimes with the right intentions, or coming to a situation they never could have imagined. And that is amazing. And that's one of the reasons that Enterprise resonates with me. It lets you find your own point of light in the gray. And I mean, and no matter which plot we're talking about here, either Phlox and Cutler or the whole Valachians and the Menk and the Cure, those are both very gray, and they're left gray, which is why you keep thinking about this afterwards, because no matter what choice was made, it could have been the right or wrong choice, and you might never know. And that is the power of Enterprise as a series.
Wow. Well said. I never thought about it that way, but I appreciate that so very much. And this episode is such a great example of that. Before we jump into the heaviness of this episode, because it is so intense, I wanted to just point out two little nuances that did make me laugh that I appreciated. The first one was our beloved T'Pol, who is a stoic Vulcan. She's tough stuff. She's been through some stuff. She's a rock. Even T'Pol, the Vulcan, doesn't want to go to the dentist. And when Phlox says, okay, let's just fix your tooth, she literally gets up and says, oh, I can see you're busy right now. She doesn't want to do it. And I thought that was pretty funny.
I agree. Smart woman.
Yes, of course, he asks her a question while he's working on her mouth and she can't talk, but I found that very comical. The other part that just made me have a little smile was when the Valachians are asking T'Pol and Archer if they're from the same planet. And she says, well, we may look alike, but that's where the similarity ends. And she was just speaking factually. I don't think she meant it as a dig or a quip at all. Or maybe she did. But Archer certainly took it that way, because he has this look on his face that is so funny, where he's like, that just made me smile.
That is funny. And I love that scene, because I think the idea of parallel evolution is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I like how in this episode, again, we're tying the two plots together, because we have all the talk about interspecies romantic relationships, plus we have the two species living on one planet. So there's a parallel right there, and it's a nice thread that weaves through both parts of the episode and kind of pulls it together and ties it together. And that scene when Phlox is talking with crewman Cutler and about the differences and the similarities between their species, and she says, well, it doesn't matter, and he goes, well, it matters to you with the Menk. Well, boom, right there connects the two plot lines, and that was beautifully done.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I agree. And I really liked that conversation when he said, well, it matters to you. That was a very good point.
All right, should we jump into the heavy parts of this?
Yes.
All right, so first of all, I have to say that I had not rewatched this episode until we were doing it for this podcast during the pandemic. I've rewatched it a zillion times, but not since everything with COVID has emerged. And it is definitely a different experience watching this episode going through a worldwide respiratory pandemic. there were moments that gave me chills, and not in the, ooh, this is cool space stuff way, but in the, oh my God, this is hitting a little bit too close to home way. And that is something I very much hope nobody predicted 20 years ago, but it really changed how I viewed this, because having seen the desperation and the intensity of people just trying to survive and doing anything to stay healthy and get a cure over these past 18 plus months of COVID, what the Valachians were doing, it wasn't wrong. If I was in their position, I probably would have asked for a cure and warp drive and everything as well, because that's what you do to survive. So, very heavy now that I'm looking at it through the COVID lens.
Yeah, Abby, I had the exact same thought. I also hadn't rewatched this in the past couple years, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I completely agree. Seeing them with those respirator masks in the bed and all of them, it just, wow, that really hit home for me as well, and had such a different meaning than it has in the past. You're absolutely right. And I was thinking a lot about them going out into space for a year, just in the off chance of finding someone, how desperate you have to be to do that. And when he says 12 million people died before we left, so who knows how many have died since we left? I mean, and going out there and not knowing if or when you're going to reach anyone, or if or when they're going to help you, big if there, that really got to me.
Yeah, it's really hard, especially knowing that in the end, Archer kind of helps him and kind of does it, and you kind of understand and you kind of don't. And
right,
that's those gray areas. Like, there was no way for a good, once we knew there was a cure, and once they asked for that Warp 5 engine, there was no good way to resolve this relationship. Like, somebody was going to be massively disappointed. Somebody's ethics were going to feel squicky. It just became the classic rock and a hard place. And, there's no out to this that isn't something that's going to sit like a stone in your stomach, no matter what you do. And that's the kind of Star Trek that really resonates, because that's the kind of dilemma that 20 years ago was pertinent and is just as valid and important to think about and to debate over, and to realize you could probably be thinking about this in 20 more years and still not come out of that gray area with a good answer. And, in the words of Captain Sisko, you got to be able to live with it, right? I can live with it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Abby. And that's why I love this episode so much, because it does make you think 10, 20, 30 years we'll still be thinking. That's what Star Trek does so well. And they really nailed it with this one. And I know we're going to talk about the dilemma and the ethical question, but building up to that, I just wanted to mention that you can see it written on everybody's face. When Phlox first enters Archer's ready room to tell him that he's still working on it, things aren't looking very well, he has this look of heaviness on his face that is just so sad. And then when he looks into his microscope and realizes, what's going on, there's another look on his face, not to mention the looks on both of their faces during the mess hall scene, which I know we will discuss.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Archer's trying to make his decisions, you can see it weighing so heavily on him. And when he says to T'Pol, do you have a minute? And he wants to bring her into the ready room, Travis shoots this look over to Hoshi, this empathetic, like, wow. And that's why I mentioned that in the last podcast too. The directors don't have to show those cutaways. They could have just showed Archer and T'Pol walking to the ready room, showing their backs, but they did show Travis looking at Hoshi, which just adds more layers and complexity to how everybody's feeling. And so I really appreciated all of the face acting. And my heart just went out to Archer. I could really feel what he was wrestling with, because I was too. And that was just phenomenal.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. It's one of those moments that just gets to you. And I know I can close my eyes and see those facial expressions still. And even before I rewatched, I remember some of those because they are that poignant of a moment that you're like, yeah, that was the moment that they realized or they understood or they completely saw it in a different way that they didn't know if they agreed with, but they had never thought of before. And that is so Enterprise at its core too. We're expanding your horizons and we're opening your minds, and there are different ways of looking at this that still might not be right or wrong. They're just different, and it's beautiful.
Yep. I also thought it was interesting that they added yet another layer of complexity to the story that we're grappling with here by letting us in on these little tidbits about the Vulcan and Mank interactions down on the planet. Here we are, we're helping the Vulcans out, they're suffering, the episode's moving along, and then about halfway through, we are learning this very disturbing information, such as that the Mank are not allowed access to fertile lands, that they're living in these compounds, that they're working for the Mank in some fashion that we don't know a lot about, which causes us to say, hey, wait a minute, what the heck? And it's easy to see how the Enterprise crew, as well as us as viewers, would be very concerned for the Mank and feel that they're being oppressed. Then we have Phlox coming in saying, hey, this is a different culture. You're just applying your human bias to the situation. And to Phlox, it seems like a beneficial coexistence that's good for both parties. So it's just more intensity for us to chew on here. And this got me thinking about, well, first of all, the whole idea of two humanoid species on the same planet was interesting because, like they said in the episode, that's rare. And this added another layer of sadness to me when Phlox said, well, hey, they're coexisting really well. That's cool. Normally they would have wiped each other out. It, of course, made me think, well, we can't even coexist with one species. How sad. Sorry to be a downer here, but how sad is that? You know what I mean?
No, it is. And that's, again, what makes this so powerful is because we are connecting this to our time, to our life, to what was going on 20 years ago. And now still, that speaks of a timeless tale right there. But I think we've come to the time where we have to talk about the big choice.
Yep. Let's do it.
All right. So let's focus mostly on that scene in the mess hall, because we've kind of already talked about how when they were talking about the genetics and research not going well and all that. First of all, I would like to call out the lighting people in that mess hall scene because they've got the planet in the windows and the lighting is so cool because it's darker in the mess hall because it's kind of night. But the planet is emitting this glow. So Archer is like lit from behind and it's an interesting angle. It was very, very pretty. And then all the little like cabinets where they slide to get the food that Chef has left out for the midnight snacks are lit up. So props to the lighting department because that was really subtle and really beautiful. Also interesting to see Archer out of uniform again. And I feel like whenever we see him out of uniform, we get him more with his emotions out and obvious and in the forefront, whether it be anger or frustration or happiness or confusion. And I think it's really interesting. And I wonder if it's purposeful or if it just was, hey, he couldn't sleep. And of course he's not wearing his uniform to sleep because they're not pajamas. But I thought that was interesting to notice right away. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that his iced tea he was chugging was decaf because of course you're not going to sleep if you chug 3 cups of iced tea in the middle of the night.
Good point. Abby, I loved that planet out the window. Oh my gosh. That was gorgeous.
Yeah.
Absolutely gorgeous. We've talked about this before. We talked about it in Strange New World. We talked about how it's going to come up in Damage and other episodes. But when Archer and Phlox get real with each other, wow, the acting is so good. I loved the writing in this also because it got me thinking.
Yes. I have to say, before I go into what the character's doing, John Billingsley in this scene kills it. And I love when he gets the serious, like we talked about, and especially with Archer, because Archer gets plenty of serious moments. Phlox a lot of times is used more like a Quark or a Neelix, who also were funny and had the optimism and the humor. But when they got serious, whew, and that's the same thing with Phlox and John Billingsley. Like, when he gets serious, the man should win every award because he is just chill-inducing in a good way this time. And when they're having this discussion, they both have good points. And again, that's what I kept coming back to. Neither one of them is wrong. Neither one of them is coming at this from a closed-minded or harmful or standoffish or wipe your hands of the problem kind of way. They're both trying to help people or other humanoids. They're trying to help. And both of them would help some and harm others. And it's just the worst type of calculus. But what a powerful moment. And it's interesting because Phlox is a doctor. He doesn't have a rank. So there isn't any I can make you do this or make you do that. And the doctor can always outrank the captain in matters of health and wellness and crew safety and all that anyway, for as far as we go in track. But it's interesting to see the two of them because when Phlox really stands his ground and puts his foot down on something, the captain really listens. And this episode, Phlox even states about how he has gained so much respect for Captain Archer, and he doesn't know why he was surprised that he ended up doing the compassionate thing and the right thing. And you can see the level of respect deepening between these two characters in the fact that they are having this conversation. And that when Phlox is done and he says, I can't believe I almost withheld information from him, because he realizes that Archer is going to do the right thing, whatever he feels the right thing is, and that they are equals in a lot of ways. And that's interesting. But then Phlox also refers to him as the captain. So he knows, as long as it doesn't cross the hugest ethical line, he's going with what the captain says. So it's a fascinating dynamic. And I wish that these two had more episodes together.
I hear what you're saying, Abby, about Phlox standing his ground because he's having this regular conversation. But then when it's time for him to make his point, did you notice how he kind of tensed up and became much more firm? And that was cool. And right before he says, I have found a cure, and you can see he's grappling with whether to share that. And then Archer's looking at him like, okay, we're done here, but are we done here? And do you have something to say? That moment was so good.
Yes.
And I have to say, there's a line in this scene that I absolutely adore, which is when Archer says, my compassion guides my judgment. Wow. I dug that.
Yeah, it's a very Archer thing to say. And it's the kind of things that make some people go, oh, Jonathan Archer. And some people go, oh, Jonathan Archer. So I think it's polarizing because people can say, well, he should know better and he shouldn't be doing this and that. No, he shouldn't. He's the one out there figuring all this out, and he's doing the best he can by being compassionate, which is very human. So I'm firmly on the side of, oh, Jonathan Archer, but I can understand the other side too. This episode highlights that back and forth so well in so many ways.
Most definitely. Yeah. I love that about Archer. And he said it with so much conviction. I appreciated that because I could picture myself on the other end of that conversation with Phlox and having similar feeling.
Abby, there's so many compelling arguments. You can go back and forth, like you said. It almost has like a Tuvix vibe for me. And I did learn in my research that there was an original ending written for this episode that John Billingsley actually preferred, where Phlox did disobey Archer's orders to give the cure, but the network demanded a rewrite because they wanted the crew to be on the same page at the end, which is very interesting. While I really get Phlox's pragmatic view and broad perspective of letting nature take its course and everything that he explained so eloquently, I totally get it intellectually, scientifically, logically, but what I just can't wrap my head around is that Phlox and Archer would purposely withhold this cure that would end suffering right here, right now. For me, there's just a lot of what-ifs on the table. I know Phlox says that the future's pretty set in stone, but we don't really know what's going to happen. There are no guarantees. What we do know is that this species will die. and they're basically being condemned to death, which just doesn't sit well with me. Also, for me, it feels out of character that Phlox and Archer would make this decision despite the science, and I just can't wrap my head around that. So after much reflection, I do disagree with the decision, but I totally get it. And I think with the Prime Directive and non-interference, it kind of had to go this way at the end of the episode. But I do wish that Archer had stuck to his guns. And I wish that Archer's compassion had overridden the pragmatism, which I think would have been a better reflection and demonstration of Starfleet's humanitarian values. And while the episode does leave me with this kind of bummed out feeling at the end, it in no way takes away from how spectacular I feel it is, and all of this wonderful character work between Archer and Phlox and character development and all the great things that we are talking about in this episode. But I am going off on a tangent, so I'm going to bring it back here. Let's get back to the story here. And Abby, let's talk about the part at the end where Archer chooses not to give the warp drive technology to the Valachians. So when Archer said, sorry, we can't help you with the warp, that was another brilliantly acted scene because you see Archer hesitating, right?
Yep.
And then you see Phlox behind him feeling for Archer. And then the Valachian says, well, we appreciate all your efforts. So you know he's super bummed out, but he's being polite and respectful. And oh my gosh, that scene's killed me.
Yeah. And the other part I like about in there is where Archer makes that really pointed comment of, I wouldn't be surprised if you figured out a cure for yourself. Like, it's almost like he was saying, we know there's a cure. Go out there and figure it out. It's like when people give you a calculus equation and they're like, here's the answer, work backwards. Well, now the Valachians kind of got that hint with that not so subtle speech moment there that it's out there, find it. And I really want to know what happens.
Yep.
Like if we go back in, 2 generations, 200 years, whatever, and then maybe again where Discovery is now, 900 some years in the future, are the Menk super out there warping around and, have they reached their potential and the Valachians are gone? Are they still living together? There are so many possibilities and we'll probably never know, but I can't stop thinking about it. And I don't know what choice I would have made as Archer. Ask me on a different day and I'll have a different answer.
Yes. When he said the thing about the cure, it's almost like he was willing it to happen. And I loved that too. And I'm curious about the mink as well. I have to say that was a good point. Where are they now? I really enjoyed the mink in this episode. I found them really interesting. And I like the makeup design and the acting, the personalities. That I found them fascinating.
I agree. And you know what? Some of our listeners have pointed out to us that neither one of us is a big Star Trek Online person. And there are some Enterprise connections in these early seasons of Enterprise that show up in there. So if anybody knows if the Menk are in there and they can answer that, please tell us, because that would be absolutely thrilling to find out.
Ooh, that's a good point, because we just learned from people on Twitter that the aliens from Silent Enemy do make an appearance in Star Trek Online. And yep, if there's anything about the Menk, we want to know. So, Abby, let's talk about the part of the episode that focuses on the Phlox-Cutler relationship with the wonderful Kelly Waymeyer, who we mentioned in Strange New World. So sad that she died so young.
She's a very good actress. And it's interesting that she is befriending Phlox the way she is. And I think it's interesting to watch her very human reactions to everything. And I like at the end that he calls her as a friend and she's right there for him, because we see Phlox and his friendships with other people like Hoshi and how they're practicing the Denobulan language, which is adorable. And it's a nostril is a great line. But we see his relationships even with other women, with T'Pol, with Hoshi, and they are deep and they are meaningful and they are good friendships. But there is something different with Cutler, and it's interesting to see Phlox explore that. And it's interesting that we're setting up the first bits here about how Denobulans might have these really extensive marriages and family systems and all this, but they're really fairly modest and don't really like to be touched. I just always have thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I really liked this exploration of their friendship as well. I agree. She was a wonderful actress, very natural. And you could see when she was trying to flirt with him after the movie and, well, here's my room and bye. And she's wanting to, extend talking to him. I mean, that all seemed really realistic to me. And I found it all super interesting. And at the end, when they have their heart-to-heart talk, which I'm glad that they did, when she says, I want to be your friend, and he says, well, what does that mean? And I like that he put it right out there. What does that mean? Let's clarify this. I thought that they had a really good, mature interactions and interesting conversations. And the whole thing was really interesting to me.
Yeah, I like that they had that conversation too. And I like how Phlox used the conversation about the Menk and what was going on and pulled it back around to their situation between the two of them. And it was really beautifully done. And the only thing that bothers me about that scene is the very last thing she says, and she's like, let's see where it goes. And the gut in me goes, oh, that's not cool, because that's what a horrible, ambiguous way to end this conversation. But then I also think to myself, she just found out a lot of stuff. Mm-hmm. So my guess is she needed a little bit of time to digest, and she just needed a way to end the conversation for now. And that was probably her way of doing it, because that might have been how I reacted if I found out somebody that I was interested in had 3 wives already. And but I don't know, because it's a new situation. So, but it was a great relationship, and that conversation just shows how well the writers already knew what they wanted to do with Phlox from the beginning, and that's cool.
Yeah, I agree. Abby, I'm curious, what was your take on Phlox's perspective? Do you think he was interested in her? He didn't really talk about his end. He talked a lot about, I think she might be attracted to me. Do you think he's interested?
I think he's intrigued and wanting to know. I think before he would let himself feel interested, he would need to know that she understood all of what a relationship with him would entail, because he's very respectful about that. So I think it's almost like his prelude to being interested. The fact that he's even mulling it and considering that it might be a possibility and we need to share this is a big step.
Yeah. Well, we've arrived at Porthos's pick, which is our favorite part of the episode. Abby, what's your favorite part?
Well, there were about 15 favorite parts in here, but the one that I settled on is I loved that we got to see Hoshi doing her job. It was Hoshi in action. We saw her speaking Menk. We saw her speaking Valachian. We saw her speaking English. We saw her speaking Denobulan. It was so nice, especially after the last episode where she was, hunting down trivia on Malcolm, to actually see her doing her job, because she is so smart and so quick and so caring. Like, you can see as she's trying to talk to them, she's giving them all those nonverbal, open, welcoming cues. And I love seeing Hoshi work. And the scene between her and Phlox, like I said, the nostril is hilarious, and the back and forth between them, it's just really fun. So I love the Hoshi we get in this episode.
Yeah, that's a great pick, Abby. I also really appreciate seeing when Hoshi is being just so talented at what she does. I love when we get to see her doing translations and the UT and all of the amazing and brilliant stuff that she does. So it's always wonderful to see that. And I appreciated her, downtime relationship stuff as well, with the practicing Denobulan with the doctor. And at the end, when she says to him, my advice, get out of sick bay. I really liked that moment, because they do have a friendship. And I like that Hoshi is comfortable to give Phlox advice like that. They're at that point now. So Hoshi is just so multi-talented. She's like a Renaissance woman. And that was a good pick. Oh, no pun intended for civilization. Okay.
What about you, Melanie? What was your favorite?
Like you, I have many favorite parts because this episode is such top quality. But the part that really got me was one line when, after Archer says, well, we can stay and help them. And T'Pol says, the Vulcans stayed to help Earth 90 years ago. And then she pauses. We're still there.
Yes.
There's something about that line and the way she delivers it that just gave me the chills. That was a chilling moment. It just, wow, was like a punch to the gut. That was awesome. That's my favorite part.
That is a perfect little moment. And I agree. The way that pause is in there adds so much meaning to that one little line.
Yeah, I mean, it was so telling. Like, I would never have thought of that. And when she made the analogy, you could tell that Archer, it was sinking in for him the way it was sinking in for me.
Accessing library computer data.
Okay, well, it's time for the sharing of some trivia. Abby, what can you tell us about Dear Doctor?
All right, so I have kind of a behind the scenes one here that shows that John Billingsley is not only a phenomenal actor, but a great prankster, because he was quoted in saying about this episode, the way we managed to make sure that the image, the picture, lasted long enough to match the dialogue is we pre-recorded the dialogue and played it over the scene as we acted it. So I asked them if they would allow me to just record some fake dialogue. So the scene with me standing on the bridge, I was supposed to say something to the effect of, isn't it marvelous the way these humans are so kind and considerate, stopping to help people in need here and there in the middle of space? But instead I said, ooh, doesn't the captain look nice in that tight suit? I wonder if he's wearing any underwear. My, how I'd like to get him somewhere off to my... Anyway, I went on in this vein and everybody broke up. My mental picture of that is absolute hilarity. So I had to share that with the world.
Oh my gosh. I didn't know that. That is hilarious. And having seen John Billingsley on Twitter and seeing interviews with him, it doesn't surprise me because he's a very clever, clever, funny guy. And I can totally see him pranking people. And I've also seen some of the bloopers where Scott Bakula also pranks and enjoys pranks. So I could see the two of them just laughing together over that. I would love to see that outtake.
I agree. So what about you? What's your trivia this week?
My trivia is that Christopher Rydell, who played the unnamed Valachian astronaut, is the son of Joanne Linville, who played the Romulan commander in the original series episode, The Enterprise Incident. And I thought that was really neat.
Transfer of data is complete.
Okay, now it's time for our Vulcan's verdict. Now, Abby, we now have half grapplers on the table.
Woo!
So if either one of us would like to use a half grappler on our scale of 1 to 10, it is available. Abby, on a scale of 1 to 10 grapplers, how do you rate this episode?
Well, this is a phenomenal episode of Star Trek, and I can't stop thinking about it and the choices and changing what choices I think I would have made. I love the deep look into Phlox and the Zenobulans. I love the relationships between the characters in here. I love the acting. I love the lighting. This is a really good one. The one little thing that stopped this from being an all the way up there top 1% number 10 grappler was the fact that when Archer was talking to Phlox and he was talking about how they were going to create a directive someday, and I was like, the speech was beautiful, and then he pulled out the word directive, and I'm like, wow, just hit us over the head with that stick. Come on, we got that. You could have used any other word, but that one little thing was pretty much it. So 9 out of 10 grapplers.
That's funny, Abby. You're right. I guess another word could have been chosen, kind of bonk bonk on the head. But I have to say, I do love that speech with the music playing in the background.
It was a hero moment.
It sure was. It seems like the episode is wanting us to think about the Prime Directive and how we feel about that upcoming policy. And I have to say, I do have mixed feelings about the rigidity of the Prime Directive. And I'm sure throughout the run of the podcast and throughout Enterprise, we'll have an opportunity to revisit that again. And it always reminds me of the TNG episode Pen Pals, which I love, when Picard says, and I'm paraphrasing here, the purpose of the Prime Directive is to protect us. I love that moment. But I digress. Back to my rating.
I agree with you. I mean, I don't know what more I can say. It's a top-notch episode, very thought-provoking, so well acted, so well written. It's a classic. And it's, as our friend Chris from Shelf Nerds would say, it's a trek for all time.
In fact, I would like to direct our listeners to Chris's YouTube channel, which we were saying is called Completing the Shelf, and he is on Twitter at Shelf Nerds. He is dropping a Trek for All Times video on this episode on the 24th of October, 2021. So if you want to hear even more and different things about this episode, go check that out because it is totally worth it.
Yes, absolutely. Check that out in October for sure. He produces amazing, wonderful Star Trek content.
Abby, I also gave Dear Doctor a 9 out of 10 grapplers.
My chronometer's running backwards, sir.
Incoming transmission.
You read my letter?
Now it's time for Daniels to send us back in the timeline so we can hear some of your thoughts and picks. Abby, what do you have for us tonight?
All right. I've got two great ones because our last two episodes have provoked some really interesting back and forth on Twitter. So I strongly suggest if out there you want to talk more about Enterprise and specifically these episodes, check it out because there's been some fun stuff. So the first one I have is from our episode on Cold Front, and this is from our good friend Peter Trek1 at Peter Trek1. And he said, this episode is one of my favorites from Enterprise Season 1. I consider it a core Enterprise episode because it provided the background history of the Temporal Cold War, a key multi-season arc. The visual effects used for Daniel's Temporal Observatory is my favorite visual effect in all of Enterprise. It provided an example of how advanced visual effects can be done on Enterprise, even though the show took place decades or centuries before other Trek shows. I agree with your comment on having a follow-up to the Temporal Cold War arc in a future episode of Current Trek. In addition to Discovery, a Temporal Cold War follow-up could also be done in short treks if they make them again, or on lower decks. Hey, Suliban already had a cameo on Mariner's Conspiracy Corkboard in Season 1. Overall, I give Cold Front an 8.5 out of 10 grapplers. So bravo, Peter, for having a half grappler on the first episode with half grapplers. And thank you so much for those comments. I loved all the discussion, and we couldn't agree more about the Temporal Cold War.
Yeah, I want to thank Peter also, another Temporal Cold War fan out there. And those visual effects were spectacular.
All right, I've got one more for us here, and this is from Silent Enemy, our last episode, which this one surprised me with how many people really wanted to talk about it. And this is from Norman C. Lau at Lounge Lizard, and he says, I've always felt that this is the first step in Archer shedding his optimistic naivete. He so badly wants space to be full of wonder and hope and opportunity, but there is a reality that in this episode will educate him to the other side of exploration. And yeah, it's interesting, the journey and the arc of Archer from leaving space dock to where we see them end up. And this is well put for how he takes one of those first steps into growing into the captain we know he will become.
Yeah, I really appreciated Norman's comment as well. That is such an insightful point that at the beginning, Archer is just so full of wonder, and I think naivete is a good word choice there. And this episode does seem like a turning point for him. So thank you, Norman. And if you've enjoyed this conversation and would like to continue the discussion with us, you can reach us at First Flight Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And what's the best way to contact you, Abby?
The best way to reach me is on Twitter. That's at Abby M. Sommer. That's SOMMER. And you, Melanie?
And I can also be reached on Twitter at ShuttlePod2, ShuttlePodTWO. We want to thank you for spending this time with us. Teek, teek. We will be back next time with Sleeping Dogs, the 13th episode of Season 1. And as always, we leave you with this quote from Captain Jonathan Archer.
The most profound discoveries are not necessarily beyond that next star. They're within us, woven into the threads that bind us, all of us, to each other.